G'day there. Today, I'm going to be talking about a book by Stefano Corbo. It's called From Formalism to Weak Form, The Architecture and Philosophy of Peter Eisenman. Now, if you know anything about Eisenman, you'll know he's a pretty smart guy. As my old professor, an accomplished architectural historian in his own right, once put it,
"You think you can understand Eisenman after reading one book? Forget it!"
Now, I guess that's why I've arrived at Stefano Corbo's book. Maybe someone else can sum up his immensely abstract career in a way that I can understand a bit better. And by teaching that information to strangers on the internet, I'll remember it a bit better too. From Formalism to Weak Form, the Architecture and Philosophy of Peter Eisenman starts with Corbo identifying the distinct phases of Eisenman's career, from a tangled web of diachronic projects, essays, propaganda, and Eisenman's own biography and context, of course. No doubt a colossal effort in its own right. The goal of this is to create, in Corbo's words, a heterogeneous and interconnected cartography of Eisenman's work that is non-hierarchical and to overcome the limitations of a linear chronological narrative. The word cartography is key. In general use, the word map has an implied objectivity, whereas cartography refers to the art of map making. You could say this book is more closely related to an IKEA instruction manual for reading Eisenman than it is a series of facts of a historicity of Eisenman's life, thoughts, and work. Each chapter of a book explores a particular evolutionary line of Eisenman's work, covering the interpenetrating concerns, anomalies, and ambiguities in a generally chronological order, beginning with formal terrorism, the topic of today, archaeology, deconstruction, arbitrariness, process, effect, and oppositions. One final note Corbo adds is that, in the end, this book intentionally provides no universal messages to comprehend or finite forms to analyse from Eisenman's body of work. After completing his doctoral thesis in England, Eisenman returned to New York, where he quickly solidified himself, along with Michael Graves, John Hayduck, Richard Meyer, and Charles Gwathmey, as the Five Architects, which were pontificated as the totality of the New York architectural scene. Their group debut was in 1969 at the New York Museum of Modern Art, in an exhibition promoted by CASE, the Conference of Architects for the Study of the Environment. A prestigious occasion to be sure. The only catch was, CASE was founded by Eisenman himself 5 years earlier, and this exhibition was only the start of a clever propaganda campaign. I think Corbo began this chapter with this anecdote because it seems to be a fantastic example of Eisenman's modus operandi. He would later set up the official-sounding Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, an anti-academic institute that invited promising architects to conduct their own research as an alternative to universities, the primary purpose of which was defending and promoting the positions of Eisenman and his colleagues. Another mouthpiece for Eisenman's views was his magazine, Oppositions, co-founded by Kenneth Frampton and Mario Gandolzonas. While open to publishing various studies, a common theme of the magazine was the absence of political and ideological references, instead limiting the discussion to theoretical and disciplinary questions instead. With this media network pushing and confirming his views, you can start to see Eisenman as the formal terrorist of the Five Architects that Manfredo Tafuri claimed him to be. But was he a full-on formal jihadist? And what were the views he was trying so hard to propagate? Key to the identity of the Five Architects was the absence of politically charged references that had been ubiquitous with European modernism. Even notions of construction and function were willfully discarded by the group towards the goal of comprehension of the syntactical mechanisms that regulate architecture, its own autonomy. The group represented a shift from the slogan, "Form ever follows function," towards a description of architecture that could only be self-defined. This nihilistic abandonment of the established beliefs and understanding was driven by the crisis of modernity and Eisenman's sincere belief that modernism and modern architecture were diametric in nature. Modern architecture had, and still has, long been purported as a rupture from humanism, the end of humanity's centrality in architecture. This was key to modernism as a theory, but never eventuated in practice. Put as simply as I can, while the phrase form ever follows function sounds like a removal of humans from the equation, function is derived from how a specific space serves humans. For Eisenman, functionalism was no different than a late stage of humanism. While it can be said that the protagonists of modernism were well aware of this through 𝒯𝓇𝓆𝓉's reterritorialization of humanism and Mies van der Rohe's deterritorialization of humanism, many architects conceived of modernism as simply a stylistic manifestation of formalism and a new formal lexicon. While initially attempting a radical revision of the modernist movement to an iteration that did not make this mistake, by the 1960s, it was clear that sentiment on modern architecture had soured, and that a new direction was required. At this time in his life, he was convinced this direction and the ideal of modernism, the true rupture from humanism, lay in syntactics. And while syntactics could be an entire discussion of its own, he was essentially focusing on the internal mechanisms of evolution, transformation, and combinations, rather than architecture's external relations to society or politics. For Eisenman, real architecture only existed in drawings and models. The moment it was built and subject to the geometries of making, planning, and of the person, it became just a building. Architecture was the process of that idea generation. In my own personal views, I feel like this is a little bit extreme, and I'm pretty sure Eisenman agrees with that later on as well. I'd say architecture's best definition is not a building and exists somewhere between the realms of tectonic and sculpture. Either way, Eisenman's whole propaganda network seemed to be established to counter the misunderstanding of modernism and modern architecture. Corbo writes, he feared such a misunderstanding could generate the rise of neo-functionalist positions, aimed at reducing the complexity of the modernist mission to a linear correspondence between form and content, or in worst case scenario, to a total lack of interest in syntactics. Well, who cares? To be honest, pretty much no one, but I do. I think that a complete ignorance of architecture's autonomous components would result in the death of architecture as an art. I'm not sure how accurate this is to say, but imagine trying to write a poem if no one knew what a metaphor was. Architecture goes beyond a political statement or a reflection of society. It exists independently of these things, just like how music isn't always a reflection of society's loneliness, narcissism, or debauchery. Music's beauty comes from things like rhythm, resonance, and crescendo. A critical component of Eisenman's thoughts from this period find their origin in Noam Chomsky's language development theory from the 1960s. Now, truth be told, I don't know much about Noam Chomsky's work beyond manufacturing consent, but luckily for me, I've got a linguist mate. From the linguistic theory, Eisenman was able to find consonance with the distinction between the deep structure and the superficial structure. That is, the distinction between the perceptive dimension and a conceptual dimension. In linguistics, the superficial structure corresponds to the physical spoken component, while the deep structure corresponds to the syntactic component. From what I gather, this is the abstracted form of what was said. Say, the deep structure of the phrases Bob owns a cat, and the cat is owned by Bob, would be the same abstracted form, despite the superficial forms, what was said, obviously being different. Important to Chomsky's theory is that the nature of this linguistic abstraction is essentially a black box. Its nature can only be probed by its outputs. At this time, when Eisenman draws a distinction between buildings and architecture in his work, this is why. He suggests that building is the superficial structure, the output, and that architecture is what is occurring in the deep structure, this creativity black box. This is exactly what Eisenman's early works in the infamous House series were trying to explore, the nature of the black box, by creating a variety of designs using techniques like dislocation, rotation, and overlay. I think he was attempting to find a glimpse at the mechanisms that govern architecture. Additionally, Argentinian theorist Mario Gandalzonas would stress that in Eisenman's work, as a result, the term formal came to have a purely relational connotation, and that it would have no expressive or representative function, and that sign was meaningless in architecture. It's through my assumption, this is because the idea of sign corresponds to the superficial structure, in this case, buildings, and so was therefore meaningless to architecture. For this period of Eisenman's formal terrorism, Corbo examines the years from 1969 to 1978, during which Eisenman only designed 12 houses, and only 5 of which were ever built, known as his house series. Corbo claims that the house series can be analysed in 2 distinct cycles, the first from house 1 to house 4, and the second from house 6 to house 10. However, they're all connected to each other through an obsessive sequence of architectural elements and internal logic. The homogeneous appearance of all the houses betrays the underlying complexity of his process, essentially producing similar superficial structures by accentuating different elements that affect the deep structure. Please, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I imagine this here is as if someone took a balanced musical composition and said, hey, let's explore what happens if we change this chord, or let's make a version that utilizes crescendos and decrescendos much more. I believe that's the point of the house series and what ties them all together, to explore the direct effect of each modification. The first cycle of Eisenman's formal terrorism, House 1 to House 4, contained his so-called cardboard architectures and was permeated with the experience of the 5 architects discussed earlier, the departure from social and political territories. The cardboard architecture is, for once, pretty self-explanatory and straightforward. The first 4 houses were to be made of cardboard. Maybe not literally, but again, for Eisenman, architecture only existed in models and drawings, so maybe he meant for them to literally be made out of cardboard. Either way, it can be described as a revision of the much-scorned international style, particularly the work of Le Corbusier and 𝒯𝓇𝓇𝓾𝓈𝓉. The idea behind the use of cardboard was not because of its immaterial nature, but instead to point out the conceptual and self-referential substratum that generated the houses, and to simultaneously distance the houses from any reference to materiality, use, or construction method, along with the use of a Roman numeral naming system, which was also an attempt to distance the work from any author, subject, client, or function at all. House 1 and House 2 were closely tied with Eisenman's analysis of 2 works by 𝒯𝓇𝓇𝓾𝓈𝓉, Casa del Fascio and Casa Giuliana Frigerio. Corbo notes that these particular houses are distinguished by their different mechanisms of generation, suggesting that the design process for Casa del Fascio moved from exterior into interior, while Casa Giuliana Frigerio was a process of explosion from interior to exterior. Drawing upon these same instruments used in this analysis, House 1 and House 2 resulted in a dynamic displacement of different floors and volumes within the envelope of the building. This ideal was then constrained to a plan generated by a grid used by Whitaker in his formal analysis of Palladio and Palladian villas, then punctuated with articulation of solid and void elements borrowed again from Terrani. The resulting plan of House 1, apart from the kitchen and bathroom areas, was successfully devoid of all signs of any figurative or functional characterization. Additionally, for the first time in House 1, Eisenman questioned the role of structure as a primary expression. If constructed forms necessitated structural beams and columns, in House 1 they were iconic, they did not hold anything up or perform any structural roles. Corbo says that House 1 was, in a sense, representative of the formal strategy that Eisenman would later develop, but still lacked the propagandistic impetus or colder arms that's usually associated with projects of this nature, such as Domino or Villa Savoy. House 1 was not yet a manifesto for Eisenman's programmatic intentions. As we move on to House 2, the missing impetus becomes solidified, however. Building off the foundation of House 1, Eisenman for the first time employs the use of his famous 9-square grid, emblematic of his diagrams of interiority, whatever those are. The originating agent for this design was a single, intentionally arbitrary diagonal displacement. Intentional in order to maintain the entire process of architectural creation as arbitrary, unrelated to both individual or site, uncontaminated. The displacement would result in the grid of 𝒯𝓇𝓉, which would then be abstracted through a series of formal operations. Particular attention needs to be given to the exact strident moment that abstraction grates against the structure of precise functions for the kitchen, bathrooms, and staircase. Apparently House 2 is a bit of a cult classic for this exact reason. It's quite didactic in its experience, showing the precise moments when architectural creativity and abstraction gets punctuated with interstitial spaces of architectural practice and function. So why bother doing all this? Again, Corbo is quite precise in arguing that what Eisenman sought to achieve with the house was understanding the internal mechanism that generated the architecture itself. He's trying to discover the language of architecture, whose only discursive elements were defined by a formal language, one of which House 2 sought to invite the visitor to understand: the grid of 𝒯𝓇𝓉, dichotomy between figure and ground, and the void spaces. Another critical element of linguistic origin is applied to the structural system of House 2, both 𝒯𝓇𝓉 and walls being designed as structural, in an ambiguous system where the distinction between structure and its representation was terminated. In a quote from Eisenman himself, it's revealed that the goal of which was to translate the value of the linguistic concept of floating signifiers to an architectural element, in this case, a wall. Now, it seems like there's a lot to unpack around floating signifiers, but really, a floating signifier is just a word without an agreed upon meaning. Great examples generally being things like capitalism or communism, words that don't really have the same meaning to different people, and may even have conflicting meanings. A non-linguistic version of this could be the Rorschach ink blot test. Regardless, Eisenman says, "When I built House 2 with a wall system that could support the house, and a column system that could support the house, there is a sense of redundancy with the two systems. When you have this redundancy, the walls are either structural or signs. Is it possible, as in language, to separate out the sign and the wall to have what could be called free-floating signifiers?" Stefano offers us another reading of House 2, as deriving from the interaction of different formal relationships. In this understanding, the complexity of relationships between the relationships is allowed to become perceivable through the use of Eisenman's own diagrams, acting as explanatory devices to describe the myriad internal operations, displacements, rotations, compressions that have taken place. Through this diagrammatic process, Corbo notes that 6 scenarios for generating architecture have been outlined, and that through such an obsessive, rigorous process of understanding the deep structure of this project, the deep structure's elements began to manifest into the superficial built form. In this understanding, it seems to be that Eisenman's diagrams constitute a rudimentary dictionary of sorts, to continue the linguistic analogy. In the end, House 2 was the result of a process of decomposition, breaking a whole project into its individual parts and analysing the shit out of it and its relationships to other elements, exactly as Eisenman did with those early analyses of 𝒯𝓉𝓉's projects. The significance of this isn't overlooked, as Corbo claims to some extent House 2 is the compendium of all Eisenman's speculations on 𝒯𝓉𝓉, and that something that's occurring here is a process that some people may call reterritorialization of 𝒯𝓉𝓉's work to contemporary architecture. Despite this obsessive purity to the design, House 2 also raised ambiguities and prompts for future investigations that were seemingly missing from the earlier prototype House 1, one of which was the 9-square grid, which Eisenman would later probe during his investigations into deconstructivism, which may or may not be a real thing. Regardless, Eisenman's formal investigations had left their nascency. Next up, House 3 and House 4. They were procured in much the same way as House 1 and House 2. Denial of all environmental and experiential factors in a relentless pursuit of architectural autonomy beyond a phenomenological lens. Rather than the dislocation of two cubes, as in House 2, House 3's germinating agent was the overlay of two cubes at different rotations, resulting in an entirely different quality of spaces and articulation. In conclusion to the first cycle of the House series was House 4 of the same year, which represented an evolution in Eisenman's strategy to more complex formal goals, albeit never being realised through construction. The starting cube was subject to numerous operations of bisection, rotation, inversion, elaboration, and transformation in the pursuit of its inner logic, and can be read as Eisenman's first purely diagrammatic project. A crucial note that Stefano Corbo makes here is that House 4's series of diagrams are not only concerned with what he calls integers of construction, but also for the first time, materiality. This is a paradigm shift from his earlier works that just relied upon a removal of materiality altogether, and an almost dimensional leap forward in terms of complexity, given the innate links between materiality, human perception, and construction methodology. This would be expanded upon in 1975 with House 6 and the beginning of the second cycle, as Corbo puts it, of the House series. While the project shares the same theoretical pedigree as House 2, even from a glance you can tell it's dramatically different from the earlier works. While it similarly consisted of a squared space containing different levels and an external perimeter that regulated perception of the internal mechanisms, the biggest contrast came from the insertion of asymmetries, displacements, and disjunctions of the project. One of the biggest examples of this may be the arbitrary gesture that shaped this entire project itself, the L-shaped circulation paths crossing the domestic space. These serve to corrode the symmetry of the highly regimented 9-square grid, and degrade the recognizability of the spaces that it contained. It's been argued that figments like these, on top of already abstracted process, elevate the project to a genuine linguistic discourse, and in turn, free it from the conventional constraints of ornament, structure, and function, and result in the first clear definition of Eisenman's formal strategy. In contrast to the obsessive and protracted sequence of diagramming in House 4, his process in House 6 was somewhat streamlined as well, by limiting both the number of transformations and the number of elements they were applied to, with Corbo suggesting the resulting diagrams replace notions of materiality, function, and meaning altogether. Something else Eisenman sought to achieve here is integration of functional obligations. No longer were stairs relegated to interstitial spaces and disrupting the otherwise abstracted composition. Thanks to the use of colour, they were now able to be converted into isolated objects in his diagramming. From here we skip a few houses, I guess they weren't any good, and we arrive at House 10, again an unbuilt project, and one representing a moment of transition in Eisenman's career, where he attempted to distance himself from the formalism and rationalism of the earlier cycle of houses. Instead, in House 10, Corbo notes two different aspects present. Both a continuing fascination with tyranny, as represented in the internal articulation, and secondly, his nascent interest in the notion of trace as a conceptual basis for his projects. I don't know what trace is. Regardless, from Casa del Fascio, House 10 borrowed the notion that frontal views of an object could provide different readings to those views granted from a corner of an object, ultimately leading to a condition where one was required to move around a building in a sequence, from front to corner, side to corner, back to corner. Whereas earlier houses represented his experimentation with architecture as linguistic phrases and discourse, House 10 is analogous to architecture being conceptualized as a full text, a format of which carries with it a sequential method of reading, hence the interest in how a different understanding could be reached with different sequential set of viewing angles. This led to the generative matrix of a house being the quadrants derived from the fragmentation of a cube, in which each quadrant had a unique function, while the space between them was relegated to technical elements and staircases. In my own observation, part of what he's doing here isn't wholly dissimilar to the work by his contemporary, John Haydock, in his Wall House series. In terms of conceptualizing of the bisection of space between function and circulatory elements. Another similarity is that while the earlier houses prioritized the generative process from simple squares and cubes, House 10 is more concerned with the grouping and relation of different forms on different bases. For the first time, Eisenman took recognition of the site on which it would be built and the different perspectives, and hence readings, that could be attained by utilising the slope of the site. Where earlier works in the House series were more designed to sit on a Cartesian plane. In Eisenman's words, House 10 was a blasphemy against the essence of Western architecture, based on the identification of form and content. While Corbo proposes that that was exactly why the project represented an intermediate step, and why it was able to break out from the shadow of modernism and chart a new theoretical course. While again not built, House 10 acted as the conceptual origin for House 11, a project which was supposedly realised in California, but mysteriously missing on Eisenman's website and generally on the internet. Regardless, it has been called the climax of all Eisenman's investigations through the 70s. It's a shame I can't find any photos. It was in this project where Eisenman would finally acknowledge the sites as a critical element of his architecture. House 11 consisted of two L-shaped cubes, assumedly articulated in the same manner of autonomous operations as the earlier houses, and then inserted into the site. Eisenman defined House 11 as a Mobius strip placed half underground, half above ground, and the underground portion containing the living areas, while the above ground containing the void. For the first time in Eisenman's portfolio, the site would acquire a formal connotation. After 1978 and House 11, it was however becoming increasingly clear that the cultural space Eisenman was working in was evaporating, even among the five architects. Michael Graves would go on to become one of the postmodern protagonists, while Frank Gehry would, well, you know. Eisenman's obsessive puritanical investigations into formalism no longer provoked any excitement. Furthermore, whether related or unrelated to this, he supposedly became gripped with pessimism about architecture and the failure of modernism, leading to the eventual abandonment of his long-time obsession in syntactics in search of greener pastures. No longer was geometry and abstraction king. Instead, architecture became a tool for Eisenman to reflect upon the instability of history. From here, Stefano Corbo wraps up the chapter on formal terrorism and begins to introduce the next topic of Eisenman's work with archaeology, as he calls it, leaving us with just one question remaining. Why did Manfredo Tafuri call Eisenman the formal terrorist of the five architects in the first place? In this whole process, no Cartesian planes were hijacked, no governing bodies abstracted, and the only waterboarding was inflicted in the form of esoteric architectural theories. It's all very different than I thought it would be. For my money's worth though, it comes from the way that a young and plucky architect stood up to the entire institution over what he thought was right. Everything from utter denial of theory from the entire continent of Europe over ideological and social references tied to modernism, to the rejection of universities tied to his anti-academic Institutes for Architecture and Urban Studies, all with his own pioneered propaganda network to defend his views. Maybe this is why Tafuri branded him a formal terrorist. Or maybe I should just read Tafuri's original text.